Well, for the sake of those of you watching later, let me just introduce myself. My name is Chad Tussing. I am the director of the Outdoor Campus West with Game Fish and Parks in Rapid City. And to give you a little bit of a insight into our agency and what we do at the Outdoor Campus, on the big scale, Game Fish and Parks is responsible for managing the state's fish and wildlife resources clear across the state. So that is often in terms of hunting and fishing is where we think about one of our main tools for that, but we also do a lot of research, a lot of habitat management. We do some translocation of animals from place to place and stocking of fish in certain bodies of water. So a lot of those activities go into the managing of those resources throughout the state. And one interesting thing about our agency is that when you look at state government and state budget, Game Fish and Parks is almost entirely self-sufficient. We don't receive any tax dollars from what's called the general fund in state government. So our main sources of income are hunting and fishing licenses in the state, plus there is a federal manufacturer's tax on hunting and fishing equipment that comes into all the states, including ours. And those monies get used for things like hunter education, wildlife research, habitat management, and those sort of things we talked about earlier. So that makes us kind of a somewhat unique as far as state agencies go, state government goes. At the outdoor campuses, our job is to teach people about the outdoors. So we teach things like hunting and fishing, canoe and kayaking, plant and animal identification, all sorts of different outdoor skills and outdoor knowledge. So that's kind of our role. Now, I've been lucky enough to be able to work with the Envirothon in the past in my home state of Ohio, been involved with various competitions, practices, and team trainings and such back there. So I'm glad to see that the Envirothon is gaining some steam and some popularity and some involvement here in South Dakota. I think it's a wonderful program, and I hope you all enjoy it as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through some information and resources that I think might be helpful for you in terms of the wildlife test. Now, the wildlife test, is focusing primarily on the terrestrial, the land-based wildlife. The aquatics portion will cover different species and those in aquatic environments. So I'm not going to be focusing much on those at all. Now, the format of the test itself, without giving too much away, is pretty broad. There are a lot of different types of questions. There are some multiple choice type questions. There are some simple identification type questions. There are some higher level thinking questions that may involve, I hesitate to say essay type questions, but there's definitely going to be some thinking and some writing involved with some of the questions. All of those kind of hints and subjects are outlined to an extent on the State Envirothon webpage. Gives you some idea of what some of the content and some of the topics could be. So pretty broad, pretty much statewide as well. You know, I am out here in the western part of the state, so maybe there's a little bit of a West River flavor to some of the questions. But there are questions from throughout the state, so be prepared for that. So some of you schools are from different parts of the state, may have a strength in your local area. Remember to think statewide on some of these questions. Also, the questions are not limited purely to species and management of species and habitat for species that we hunt. It covers, there may be some questions on game species, species that are hunted. There may be questions on non-game species as well. Species that exist for their own sake and for their role and part in our natural ecosystems, but are not hunted or used for food, for the most part. So there's a variety of those sorts of questions. Also, you want to look at the questions and think about things in terms of the big picture. So if there's a question about a species, maybe there's some in-depth questions about the habitat of those species and the management of those species. So remember, I'm coming from an agency standpoint with some of these questions. So there's some things that are really important to our agency that how we do things could translate over into the test. So there's a hint right there. The Game Fish and Parks website is a great resource for you on the wildlife side of things. So there's another hint for you. There are some, as I mentioned, some different formats on the test and some things that you'll be faced with. Some will be straight pencil on paper sort of questions that paper has the question, you figure out the answer, write it down. There are going to be some hands-on things that you need to explore and investigate to try to find the answers. You know, I'll give you a hint on one right now. I'll give you a little bit of a tip, is on some identification and even investigation on certain things. So, for example, one thing that's really important in wildlife, and my picture has changed a little bit, I can zoom a little bit on that some more, is identification of not necessarily even animals themselves, though that could be a portion of the test, is identification of animal tracks, because that is fairly important when we think about, you know, we may not see animals, we may see presence of animals, we may see their tracks, their signs. Those could be footprints, those could be feathers, those could be furs, those could be scat, those could be other signs of use. So I would strongly encourage looking at some of our common animals that we see in the state and look at their tracks and figure out a way to possibly identify or distinguish certain types of tracks. An example of one that we see very commonly here in the western part of the state, and hopefully this shows up fairly well, is basically canines versus felines. Mountain lions and coyotes are a great example. Mountain lions versus dogs, coyotes versus dogs, bobcats, mountain lions, foxes. Those are some really common tracks we see in the western part of the state that really do get confused a lot. So in this graphic, this shows you a couple of great ways to identify, distinguish, in this example, coyotes and mountain lions. One of the key things we look at when distinguishing canine and feline tracks will be the presence of claw marks in those tracks. As any of you who have house cats at home, you know that cats, felines have retractable claws. So their tracks rarely show claw marks. There are some exceptions, some special situations, but the vast majority of the time you will not see claw marks in those tracks. Compared to a dog track with non-retractable claws, you do see those claw marks. Pretty common, almost every single time. So that's a key feature to look at. Also, for example, well, size is a good example. It's tough kind of sometimes because there are dogs that have feet the same size as bobcats or mountain lions or foxes. So that makes it kind of tough sometimes as well. Also, if we look at a mountain lion track, for example, mountain lion track here, you can see hopefully in this red line, this very distinct separation between what's called the heel pad, this large pad here, and the toe pads. Compared to like a coyote, the toe pads are, you know, a little more tight, a little more oval shaped as far as the overall track. You don't have that nice distinct separation between the heel pad and each individual toe pad. So again, some things to look at and look for. Another big one is the size. Again, there are some dogs, domestic dogs, that have tracks as big as, say, a mountain lion track. But in the wild, again, unless you come across a wolf track in South Dakota, which is exceptionally rare, size is a big giveaway. Mountain lion tracks are huge, looking at 4+ inches across. So they're large compared to, let's say, a coyote track may only be 2 to 3 inches across. So, and fox tracks would be a lot smaller than that even. So tracks and tracking are good skills to have, good things to know, not just for this test, but just for observing wildlife in general, is being able to identify what animal may have been through an area without actually seeing it come through, seeing it itself. So that's because most of the time we don't see animals. We just see the signs, the tracks of what they've been, of them being through. So that's a good skill in general. Another one that is kind of a fun thing that we do out in the western part of the state is we, look at, actually, I'll take a step back a little bit. Aging a living thing is kind of an interesting hobby or interesting thing to explore. There are a lot of different ways you can do it for different species. I'm sure that if you watched or participated in the forestry session, that you may have learned how to age a tree. And that is, a very important piece of information for foresters and those managing trees and forests. On animals, it gets a little more challenging. You may learn some things on the aquatic side for doing that for fish. On the terrestrial side, we have a couple of different things, and again, I'm hoping that this shows up well here. There are some great resources online, if not. Again, we're working in kind of a different studio setting here. One animal that is fairly easy to age, believe it or not, is bighorn sheep, purely from looking at their horns. If you look closely at a bighorn's horns, there are rings and developmental sections of the horn. So when we look at this one, you can see, we see a lot of little ones, but that's not really what we're looking at. We're looking at these large, distinct separations of segments. That gives us an idea of how old that species, that animal is. So for example, on this bighorn sheep, again, I hope this comes through well on the video. If not, again, there are some great resources online. On this one, we have one distinct section here. We have another distinct section here. A third distinct section here. And as we turn around the corner, this shows up fairly well, a last section here. So if I was going to age this bighorn sheep to determine, again, how old it is, which is an important piece of information to know, I would see 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sections of that horn. So I would age this as a 5-year-old bighorn ram. Not incredibly old, but still a big mature ram. So there are lots of different variations, or lots of different ways of aging different creatures. This is a great one for bighorn sheep here in the western part of the state. Another one, which again may or may not be covered in the aquatics portion, which could be aquatic or terrestrial, are turtles. Okay, turtle shells, which is something we find pretty frequently, or even the live turtles themselves. You can actually look at the turtle shells, whether it is a box turtle or a snapping turtle, painted turtle, and you can get a fairly good estimate of turtles' age by counting the rings on their scales. When I talk about scales, again, hopefully these show up, these individual large sections on the shell. This is the carapace of the shell. Those, if you look at them closely, you can see small individual rings. Each ring is 1 year of life. And the reason those are laid down that way is because, especially, turtles hibernate during the wintertime. So they do not grow in the wintertime. Their metabolism slows down. Their growth rate slows down. So those rings are mostly laid down in the summertime as they grow. So each of those represents 1 year of life. So that's, again, another kind of handy feature. So again, those are a couple different skills that might come in handy for the test: identifying and distinguishing tracks, and possibly identifying and or estimating an age of an animal on the test. I already mentioned that there are going to be questions, or it's good to have a wide range of knowledge on both game and non-game animals. So those are kind of important things to look at. And once again, the Game Fish and Parks website is a tremendous resource for a lot of the things that will come in handy when you have to go to the competition. It is, if you can Google it, or you can just look up gfp.sd.gov. So gfp.sd.gov. Though that website has a lot of great resources. Again, as I mentioned, we're focusing in this session on the wildlife side of things. So when you do your searches and do your research, try to limit yourself towards that. It's good to research some general agency information. That's always important to know, just to know more information about an agency, what its purpose is, how it operates, what are its goals and priorities. But for this particular part of the test, the wildlife side is where you're really going to focus. The aquatic side, depending on your presentation or what you've seen and learned so far there, might have some more, there might be more resources on that website as well for that. So, again, just to kind of reiterate, since I don't think we have anybody here to do some question and answers, with the test, expect multiple formats, so possibly some fill in the blank, possibly some multiple choice, some basically write out not really an essay per se, but a short sentence or two to answer the question. Think about basic identification skills. Think about identification skills and distinguishing of not just the animals themselves, but their signs that they have been there. Want to think about how those species are managed and possibly what habitats they might need to survive. So those are all good skills and good things to think about for the test. And again, check out that Game Fish and Parks website. And through this South Dakota Envirothon page, there are other good resources and contacts for good information as well. And if you have any questions, you can certainly reach out to me through our Outdoor Campus West webpage. And that is simply outdoorcampus.org. And you can click on Rapid City. You can also click on Sioux Falls for their information as well. But through the Rapid City site, you can get direct contact information from me if that hasn't been provided to your coaches as well. So, again, I hope you got some good resources, good information out of this session. And if anyone joined us late, I'd sure be more than happy to go through some questions and answers. And if not, I wish you all the best and good luck at the Envirothon here coming up in a week from today. So if anyone joined in, feel free to shout out any questions. Otherwise, I will sign off shortly. Okay. Apparently no one else was able to join us, so thanks for watching. Hope you have a great week and a great contest next week.